WWDC was 2 days ago, and there are plenty of videos out there talking about what Apple announced, what they plan on releasing, and overall the consensus is Apple is doing a lot this year. There are people who have covered all that stuff in greater detail, and I suggest you go watch one of their videos. One YouTuber in particular, Quinn Nelson, I believe is his name, and his YouTube channel is Snazzy Labs. I think he did an exceptional job talking about the, not Reality Pro, but the Vision Pro, the $3,500 headset that Apple is going to be releasing, I believe, sometime at the beginning of next year. So we know Apple has various operating systems: iOS, iPad OS, TV OS, Watch OS, Mac OS, HomePod OS, and now whatever that's coming with the augmented slash virtual reality headset, that operating system. And while I was watching the keynote, I was actually excited about what I was seeing. Knowing that I'm not going to buy really any of the products, still excited to see what Apple is doing, still satisfied with their overall presentation, and it felt good. It was a very, very enjoyable experience. When I watched Google I/O a couple weeks ago, I fell asleep. Not lying. Literally fell asleep. Was sitting there dozing off, knocked out, and at some point I heard the word Android, and I perked back up and said, oh, maybe they're talking about phones now, which they did. But yeah, Google I/O for me was pretty boring. Apple's keynote was pretty entertaining. There are a few things that I actually care about, and I'm sure there are more. And if I took the time to go back and either rewatch the keynote or take a look at the little snapshot that describes everything that the presenter just mentioned, I'd see other things that are noteworthy. But there are really two things right here that I'm like, hey, this is something that I was looking for. First thing is RCS. We're not getting it, or the iPhone isn't getting it. That's disappointing. Apple made a ton of changes to the Messages app, but unfortunately RCS was not one of them. That would have been nice, but it is nice that you can now do things with stickers and emojis and some other stuff. I think audio messages now are transcribed. So it's nice, but it's not what I wanted. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not something that truly would have benefited everybody, iOS users and Android users. The other thing that I saw, which was actually kind of cool, nothing groundbreaking or revolutionary, but the concept now of standby mode for the iPhone, where if you turn your phone horizontally, and unfortunately it appears it only works if you're using a MagSafe charger, put it on your MagSafe charger, your phone now goes into a standby mode. Again, nothing super important, nothing super new, but it's just nice to have. The last thing that I'd like to say, which honestly has nothing to do with this particular keynote, but I think it was last year's, which I just started using recently, and when I say recently, I mean within the past 2 days, is universal control. So if you don't know what it is, essentially, it's you have your Apple product, and if you have a second Apple product, so iPad or Mac, you are able to control that secondary product with the same keyboard and mouse that you're actually using as your primary device. I kind of stumbled across it accidentally. I mean, I knew it existed, but I was sitting here and I recently purchased another MacBook, and I said, oh, wait a minute. As I'm, sliding over, I remember him saying, oh, as you move your cursor to the edge of your display, it kind of peeks over into the next screen saying, hey, do you want to use this as a secondary display? And it's pretty cool. For my work setup right over here, which you can't see, when I'm doing my editing, I have my 16-inch MacBook, a monitor, and then I already had a MacBook Air, so it was nice to be able to use that MacBook Air as a secondary display and essentially have 3 monitors now. So yes, that is a feature that is a year old, but I just started using it today, or really 2 days ago, and it just so happened that I started using it when the next WWDC happened. So I think it's noteworthy to include right here today. But the main point of this video is to discuss Apple's pricing, because I noticed something almost immediately, and I'm sure other people did too, but probably just don't care. And when I'm talking to friends about the Apple landscape, it's really, from my perspective, Apple makes one product. They make the iPhone. The iPhone has an A series chip in it. It's a touchscreen. But you have iPads, which also some have A series chips in them, also a touchpad, and for the most part, it's just a bigger iPhone. Then you had the Apple Silicon Developer Kit, which was a Mac Mini, but had an iPad chip on it. Now we have the M series chips, and essentially it's all just Apple Silicon. The phone, the iPad, the Mac, same thing. And you have to ask yourself before you buy something, what do you want? You want a touchscreen or you do not want a touchscreen? Excluding the iPhone, because that kind of is its own separate thing. Let's just look at iPads and Macs. Do you want a touchscreen or do you not want a touchscreen? Okay, you want a touchscreen, boom, iPad. Don't want a touchscreen, now we're talking about the Macs. And that's really where I'm seeing these pricing overlaps happening here. When looking at the Macs, you got to ask yourself a few questions. Firstly, do you want a big screen? Do you want a little screen? Do you want no screen? Or do you only want a screen? And that brings us to this magical $12.99 price. So the first thing we have to mention is the fact that Apple reduced the price of the base model M2 MacBook Air from $11.99 to $10.99. But through all of the videos that we've seen, all the testing that YouTubers have done, we know that you don't want to get that base model MacBook Air. So what do? At least at a minimum, upgrade your storage from 256 gigs to 512 gigs. So if you do that, you go from $10.99 to $12.99. First instance right there of that $12.99 pricing. One thing to be aware of is the fact that if you go to Apple's website and Best Buy as well, and you get that pre-configured M2 MacBook Air that comes with 512 gigs of storage and 8 gigs of RAM, you'll see that the price is actually a little more expensive. It's $13.99, but that's because for that pre-configured one, you actually get 2 additional GPU cores. If you want that, cool, pay the additional $100, but if you don't, by all means, you can go into the little configurator, select what you want, 8 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, keep the GPU to that 8-core one, and you end up at that $12.99 price. So keep that in mind. The next product, the one that Apple released today, is the 15-inch MacBook Air. That starts at $12.99. Just like before, yes, you probably don't want to get the base storage configuration, but it's important to note that for a lot of people, they probably won't think about upgrading their storage. And if they don't, then here we are again at that $12.99 price. So we got the MacBook Air M2, upgrade your storage, yes, that gets you to $12.99. 15-inch MacBook Air starts at $12.99. It's a little old at this point, and a machine that I'm not sure why it actually exists, but we have the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2 also starts at $12.99. Apple has yet to update the iMac. It still has an M1 chip, and the base model of that, you guessed it, $12.99. And one of the more recently released products, the M2 Pro Mac Mini, starts at $12.99. Now, obviously, as I've been talking, I've said, and other people have said, that you don't really want to get any of the base model M2 products, but it's interesting to see how that price structure is set. I mean, the people at Apple are very, very smart. They know what they're doing. And I don't think it's a coincidence that $12.99 just happens to continuously appear. So in closing, if you're interested in buying any of these products, you really have to take into consideration what you want. As I mentioned before, you have to ask yourself a few basic questions. Do you want a big screen? Do you want a little screen? Do you want no screen? Or do you want only a screen? Slightly unrelated, but I do think it's a little interesting that Apple kept or continues to sell the M1 MacBook Air. If they reduced the price of the M2 MacBook Air, I would have assumed that they would have also reduced the price of the M1 MacBook Air. But for them, it probably makes more sense to keep that price of the M1 MacBook Air where it is. And for only $100 more, you can now buy the M2 MacBook Air, which I'm sure that they really want to sell. If somebody happens to buy the M1, they'll be satisfied with that purchase. But I can imagine they really want to push you to spend that additional $100 and go ahead and get that M2 MacBook Air, which we all recommend that you don't get $200 more to get you 512 gigs of storage. So all in all, I just thought it was interesting. Nothing super important, as with most of my videos, but $12.99, keep that in mind. I hope this isn't the sign of prices for Apple slowly starting to creep up a little bit. I mean, they already did a little bit with the M2 MacBook Air when it first released, so we'll see how things go. But $12.99, pretty interesting.